I would like to invite Michael Herman to make his presentation. Alkışlarınızla Michael Herman geliyor. Welcome again.
Thank you. So I know we're running a little bit late, and I've got 2 minutes left. And I'm just before lunch, so I'll try to be a little bit more quick. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the future, something I call the trusted digital web. My name is Michael Herman. I'm a blockchain architect and developer. I live in Alberta, Canada. I actually live on a ranch. I own those cows. And you're trying to figure out why do cows and blockchain and digital identity connect together? Well, when you start to look at all the relationships and the different kinds of ways that we identify our cows, you become aware that there is a connection. I call it the Digital Identity Lab. But what I want to talk about today is how digital identity can be used to bring together in a more secure, more trustful way a number of elements on the internet. And a lot of it comes from my past background, working for IBM, working for Microsoft. I've always had a big interest when it comes to workflows and business processes, swim lane diagrams, those sorts of things. One of the early things that influenced me was the underlying data model that LinkedIn.com runs on. It's called the economic graph. And you can see that it's made up of the profiles of the members, the profiles of the companies, the different jobs that are there, the skills you need to acquire, or the skills you have to take on those jobs, the schools and education you might have, and of course there's a lot of knowledge sharing that happens on LinkedIn as well. And these numbers are from 2016. It's a huge graph. It's a huge graph of connections. And how do we trust these connections? We trust them because we've come to trust LinkedIn. LinkedIn is part of Microsoft. You know, that may have helped, that may not have helped. But how do we take advantage of these relationships? How do we take advantage of them in a more trustful way? The other thing I've thought a lot about as I've got into blockchain as an Ethereum developer and then on the Neo blockchain, now on Hyperledger Indy and also the Stratus platform, is this idea that every little thing that's in the universe, whether it's a person or an organization, which we talk about most frequently from a digital identity perspective, but every business document, every purchase order, every invoice, every waybill, every delivery confirmation, every part that makes up one of these chairs potentially could be tokenized or have some sort of digital identity associated with it. So these are just some of the things that are kind of in my background that help connect things together. This idea of connections, I guess, starting or being stimulated by the work on the LinkedIn economic graph, I've done a lot of work with graph databases and graph visualization. This is a project that I'm working on with a musician in Toronto, Canada. And I asked him to just sketch out at a very high level, what does his life look like? So he's a songwriter, he's a singer, he's a musician, a performer. So although you can't read it here, there's all the different events that he attends, whether it be festivals or performing at a club. There's the song lists that he's had at each event, the songs themselves, the lyrics for the songs, the musical compositions, the lyric notes that he's created that eventually might become songs. And so you get a very large network of relationships here. Not only a very large network of relationships, but different types of entities. And if you're familiar, for example, if you were at my talk yesterday, my developer talk on digital identity, we group different kinds of identities into what we call methods or method spaces. And so this might, in the fullness of time, be thousands or hundreds of thousands of entities from tens or hundreds of different method spaces. And so we have a very rich environment to work with, and how do we build this and how do we deliver this in a trustful manner. So the agenda is I'm going to talk a little bit more about problems and motivations and a solution concept that I'm working on called the Trusted Digital Web, and then I'll close with some final notes. So the trust problem. So if you think of the internet as this global communications network, and the World Wide Web is really an application that runs on top of that, it's like a fabric that knits together everything we do in our personal lives, professional lives, etc. Enables us as individuals and governments and corporations to work together, to interact, to communicate, to share and consume information. But more and more in the last, I would say, year or 2 years, maybe it has something to do with one of the overseas governments not here, we live in a world of fundamental distrust. I see that's becoming more and more evident. Distrust in the information we see, the information we read on the internet, what we consume. And I think it's becoming fairly pervasive. There isn't hardly a country on this side of the world or the other side of the world or the other side of the world that hasn't experienced some sort of uprising or distrust or civil unrest of some sort. As we consume all of this information, how do we trust it? How do we know that it's like for sure? And so that's part of the trust problem. So what is trust? Well, here's one definition. It's one party, the truster, is willing to rely on the actions of another party, the trustee, relative to some situation that's typically being directed into the future. And as the truster, trusting the trustee, you're either voluntarily or forcibly giving up control over the actions that are to be pursued. So sometimes it's voluntary trust, and sometimes it's not. So what's distrust? What's the other side? Well, the feeling that someone or something can't be relied upon. And if we think of it as a verb, it's the idea of being able to doubt or question the reliability of something, or regard somebody or something with suspicion. We also, besides the trust problem, we have the thing problem. When I started getting involved in the updating or reviewing of the decentralized identifier specification about this time last year, it was a very difficult document to approach. It was in various parts of it were in various stages of completion, and it was almost totally focused on the idea of people and organizations. And even if you look at the theme over the last couple days, we've talked a lot about people and we've talked a lot about organizations. But one of the things that I was interested in is how do we give unique digital identities to many different things, things with a capital TH. Business documents in particular, I've mentioned purchase orders and invoices, etc. And so working with the decentralized identifier community, we now recognize things as a fundamental part of the decentralized identifier specification. And I believe business documents are called out specifically. We also had the issue in the sovereign governance framework and in the glossary. There was passing mention to things, but it wasn't a first-class concept, and so subsequent work with Drummond and other people involved, custodians of the sovereign governance framework, things and this concept of a thing controller that can oversee a thing that's unable to make up its own mind or own decisions are now almost first-class citizens in the framework, at least in the documentation. So we're starting to see things, and the idea particularly about business documents. Business documents are the things that I'm passionate about and being able to transact those in a trustful way. So a little more context. This is a slide I actually used at this conference, at this workshop about 18 months ago. On the Monday evening between the 2 days, I was able to present a developer workshop on how to build smart contracts using C# and the different Microsoft technologies. And I opened the talk with this idea that if we think of the prevailing token standards, ERC20 for creating a token on Ethereum, or the NEP5, similar NEP5 token standard for creating tokens on the Neo blockchain, really we only had one method, one action that smart contract understood: transfer. You could transfer value from one address to another address to another address to another address to another address. So other than just seeing the appreciation in the value of those cryptocurrencies, there really wasn't, to me at least, any fundamental business value in having a smart contract that only could transfer value around. So I had this idea, this beginning of an idea. What if you could submit a requisition, like a timesheet or an expense report, to that smart contract? And depending on the value of that smart contract, maybe it would be paid automatically if it was below a certain amount. Maybe if it was between two levels, it would have to go to somebody in accounting, a clerk or something in accounting that could approve medium-sized expenditures. And if it was larger, maybe it needed to be routed to a manager. So this was an embryonic idea, and it was very much focused on smart contracts and creating custom smart contracts to process these requisitions. Why was it so centered on smart contracts? Because that's the only thing we had, the only thing we knew back then. And that's only 18 months ago. So 18 months ago, we were talking about the blockchain. Everybody was talking about smart contracts. They're building smart contracts for every little thing that they wanted to do. Things have changed quite a bit as we continue on. There's just more and more within the blockchain ecosystem that we're talking about. So we started with smart contracts. Now we have digital identity as another tool in the toolbox, the idea of verifiable trust for those digital identities. And we're now starting to talk about the universality of those digital identities, not just for people and organizations, but for things that are in our everyday lives and in our everyday business lives. And as Phil mentioned yesterday, we're just starting to talk about workflows and business processes, being able to work on those objects, to work with the people as actors within a business process, organizations within a business process to enact everyday business processes against those objects. So it's getting to be an exciting time. So what are the requirements for this new solution, this new trustful platform that's going to enable the kind of environment that I've begun to allude to? Well, we need to be able to process payments, we need to be able to enact business processes, and we need to be able to process business documents. And we may be able to do that in a way that's universal, that we can process any kind of document, process any kind of workflow, do it in a trusted way, frictionless. Hopefully things will execute and complete quicker, you'll be paid faster. Standards-based, there's no point in creating stuff brand new when there's lots of existing standards for how business processes are created and defined, how business documents are described in terms of schema. And general purpose, being able to run any business process in any organization. And for that solution to be end-to-end, that it runs entirely within the blockchain supported environment. So the solution needs to be fundamentally based on trust. Here's a quote from a fellow director of security for Northern Europe. Trust is one of the things that permeates across the entire business. It's the bedrock of the business, and without it, organizations are going to struggle to keep their existing customers, gain new customers, and enter new markets. And if we're living in this world, if you believe we're living in this world where there's a fundamental level of distrust, these two are in opposition with one another. So the concept of the trusted digital web has three main components. Decentralized currency or cryptocurrency, of course, that was used to give birth, if you will, to blockchain technology, give purpose to blockchain technology. That's a given, that's there. The second part is universal identity, universal digital identity, or what I call UDIDs. People, organizations, things, business documents. Every little thing on the planet, every little thing in the universe is capable of having its own unique digital identity. Some of those might be fully verifiable against a blockchain, and some of them may not. But the fact that we'll have a unique naming scheme, a unique schema for talking about entities. And then lastly, decentralized workflows. So we've got the first one, we've got the last one, we're on the cusp of having the last one. Nobody I know of is actually running workflows, business processes on the blockchain. So you could imagine different ways of doing that. That could be a special smart contract that just knows how to run a bytecode that represents a business process template. Whenever a business document of a certain type arrives, that template is loaded into the workflow engine it runs. Of course, you want that workflow template to live on the blockchain as well, because you want to be able to trust that it was this particular workflow and this particular version of this workflow that is running on the blockchain. So this is an interesting part. So it could either be in a smart contract, or now within the digital identity ecosystem, we have the concept of agents. And so this is also coupled with the idea that we actually want to do less on the blockchain. We want to use the blockchain more, but we actually want to do less on the blockchain. So maybe this workflow engine actually runs in the agent, and then what it's doing is just persisting the state and the outcome, the results, onto the blockchain. So we're seeing the blockchain and smart contracts fall sort of further and further into the background as plumbing. Just think of what you've heard over the last couple days. I think I heard smart contracts mentioned once. It really is becoming just a point of verification, a point of storing final signatures for representing the outcomes or the results of things. And you want this to be a fully integrated experience. So this shouldn't just be stuff for software developers. This shouldn't just be kind of software infrastructure. There should be a fully integrated user experience as well. So today we use the browser, the web browser on the World Wide Web to view conventional HTML pages that may have different kinds of data merged into them and that sort of thing. Maybe we need a different kind of client as well for this thing called the trusted digital web. So decentralized currency, I don't think I have to talk about that too much. Decentralized workflows, the idea of being able to do graphical modeling of workflow templates based on accepted industry standards. This isn't new, this isn't rocket science. People have been creating swim lane diagrams for a long time. There's standards like the BPMN standard from the Object Management Group, describes the boxes and the arrows and what they mean to the point where those diagrams can actually become executable, and that's being done today in commercial business process engine solutions. There's also a serialization format, so that once you have designed that workflow and you want to save it, or you want to offload it out of one system and take it to another, there's an XML format. So it means that we have a way of persisting the executable description of these workflows. And then something we've been working on is being able to take those XML descriptions and compile it into a bytecode, an efficient bytecode that can be stored on the blockchain and then executed on the blockchain as well. So if you're not familiar with swim lane diagrams, that's an example. The horizontal rows or swim lanes represent the different roles or the different actors within the business process, and the squares and triangles represent the different steps or tasks within that business process. So the idea of not having to create custom smart contracts, not having to learn Solidity, not having to use C#, but actually using a graphical tool to create and design and update your workflow templates, save them to XML, compile them down to bytecode, and then have them automatically deployed to the blockchain so that next time that purchase order comes in, the purchase order workflow runs, and it runs automatically with the most current version. Universal digital identifiers and digital identities. So the key word here is universal, and so when I talk about universal, it's not just digital identities that can be verified against the blockchain, commonly known as decentralized identities or decentralized identifiers. And so I've created a larger taxonomy. I'm not going to discuss it today, but the idea that there's verifiable digital identities and digital identifiers, and of course credentials, but then we have all kinds of other data that we want to use that DID format, that DID : foo : identifier for non-verifiable data. So we have a uniform naming scheme, a uniform indexing scheme, a uniform referencing scheme for all data on the planet. One of the contributions that can be leveraged here is something called Universal Business Language. This is another standard from OASIS. They define the schema, the JSON and XML schema, for 81 of the most common business documents, the invoices and purchase orders, shipping confirmations, etc. So BPMN for describing business processes and creating executable bytecode on the blockchain, and then UBL for defining the schema, or what we call credentials in the world of digital identity for describing these business documents. I mentioned that we needed a fully integrated experience, and that needs to come right out to the user. I believe there's a need for a new kind of browser. It'll still be based on web technologies, HTML, JavaScript, etc. But it needs to be a browser that understands how to use DIDs to reference every page, to reference every image, to reference every artifact. It needs to know how to log in to your wallet, where your credentials are stored, where your keys are stored. It needs to be able to dynamically load in different applications, much like different applications are loaded onto your phone. And it needs to be able to use that common infrastructure in terms of a shared wallet. These screenshots are actually from a project that has contributed heavily to the Hyperledger Indy and Hyperledger Aries project, and that's the Street Cred folks from New York City. And this is an example of one of their applications, and I believe Mike Lauder showed some of those in his developer tutorial yesterday. But the idea of a primarily mobile experience, because we live with our phones, mobile user experience, artificial intelligence built into that, and that also couples with the idea of a workflow engine that's implementing the rules for that artificial intelligence. The agent capability, which is being able to communicate back and forth between other agents and between edge agents and cloud agents, the idea of this wallet. And I don't think it can be underestimated how many credentials you're going to have, how many of the digital identifiers you're going to have in your life. If we think of a large corporation, a company isn't just going to have one DID to represent that company. That company within it is going to have billions of DIDs. And there's going to be millions and millions of DIDs that are transacted and exchanged, bought and sold, combined into new products on a daily basis. When you're dealing with large numbers of anything, you need some way of organizing it. There's this concept within accounting called subsidiary ledgers or subledgers. Not enough has been done in the field of digital identity and digital currency and digital business in terms of leveraging what the accounting industry already knows about. I'm fortunate to have a son who's a good accountant and lives in New York City now. So the idea of the trusted digital assistant being that client, this new version of a sort of a browser-based experience for the trusted digital web. There needs to be some sort of server in the background, just like a web server serves up pages for the conventional World Wide Web. There needs to be some sort of new kind of server that knows about DIDs. You can give it to a DID, and it's going to return stuff to you. It's going to return stuff to that trusted digital assistant. I'm working on a DID server that happens to be based on an everyday technology that probably everybody in this room is familiar with, or at least uses thousands of times a day, and it's DNS, the Domain Name Service. Most people just think of DNS as something that takes a domain name, something you type into your browser, and it goes to the server and you get an IP address back. DNS is actually much more than that. It's a framework. It's a very general framework for essentially storing what we've been talking about as credentials. If you were in my session yesterday, you learned that a credential is just a set of claims, and a claim is essentially a name-value pair. That's all DNS is. If you look here at the example, this name here, we should probably, in the world of digital identity, we should be calling that subject. So here we can see some subjects. Here we can see some names of some name-value pairs, and here we can see the values. If you are familiar with digital identity or are familiar with the DID spec that we looked at earlier, this is essentially a DID document represented in DNS. It doesn't have today, the current implementation doesn't have the verification built into it, but we already have a design that will support automatic signatures based on the BPMN workflow engine that I talked about, and then that signature will be persisted to the blockchain. Again, minimal use of the blockchain for the purposes that it's best suited for, and that's verification. So, some final notes. So I've talked primarily about the trusted digital web. That's my focus for today. There's some blockchain stuff that sits underneath that to support this frictionless, end-to-end commerce on a global scale. But one of the things that I realized when I started to think about voting, if anybody's really thought deeply about voting, and particularly voting on the blockchain, when I was part of the NEO project, that came up a lot. And you start to encounter questions like, who gets to vote? What do you call people that get to vote? If they're called citizens, what's the pathway to citizenship? And then you begin thinking, well, what I'm really creating is something equivalent of a nation state. So what are the founding principles for my nation state? What are the founding documents? Are we back in the days of creating the United States of America or creating the European Union? So this gives rise to a social phenomena, a social evolution. It's not just a technology question. Most people in the room at one point or another have probably encountered the book Crossing the Chasm and the technology adoption life cycle, and the idea is that if you build it, you'll at least attract a few people on the left, and hopefully the attraction of those early adopters and innovators will bring along the early majority. I think we're in a stage now where there's this concept of social evolution, where you start off as a single person, a wanderer, somebody who leaves the tribe to share their knowledge and wisdom with others. You gather up a party of explorers and you continue to move forward. Perhaps you develop into a family unit or some sort of clan, into a community, a society, and ultimately a nation state. I think the adoption of some of the things we're talking about, of digital identity technologies and its pervasive use, is much more akin to building a new nation state than it is the simple technology adoption of a product the way that we've experienced in the past, or if you worked for a software company, the way we've tried to sell things in the past. I think this idea of social evolution and connecting with the creation of a nation state is fundamental to the success of some of these things we're talking about. There's an interesting book called Who We Are and Where We Came From, or How We Got Here. It has nothing to do with blockchain, it has nothing to do with digital identity. But it talks about how the different people moved around the earth, and they have a term they call peopling of the earth. And that's where the term the wanderer comes from, or the concept the wanderer comes from. Someone who leaves the tribe and spreads their knowledge and wisdom with others. The people, from a North American perspective, the people that came across the Bering Strait from what is now Russia, the Russian countries, and entered North America. It's a really interesting book and contributes to this idea of social evolution. So I'm going to be able to wrap up a little bit earlier. Got just a couple slides left. We're still in the very early market, and I don't want to have kind of the last keynote or second last keynote. I don't want to be too negative, but we're in the very early market in relation to the use and application of blockchain technology, particularly digital identity. While there's a number of leading specifications and implementations and governance frameworks, they're still very new. The paint is still wet. And I believe we're not really that close to be defining what that industry standard is going to be. That doesn't mean we stop. It just means that we have to be careful. See if I can go back here. It means that we kind of have to work our way through. We have to learn. If you don't take the time to take a phased approach to things, you're not taking time to learn. You're not taking the time to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. So, a lot of what's happening today is bright and shiny, but it's fairly new, to a large extent unproven and a little bit risky. So, and we also need to consider what other technologies that are already pervasive on the internet, in your data centers, in the cloud. And change will be inevitable. I don't believe what we'll ultimately be using 10, 20, 30 years from now is what we see in the marketplace today. I have a colleague in the digital identity community, Daryl O'Donnell from Ottawa, and he wrote a report about digital wallets, and he put the proverbial asymptotic curve of the adoption of digital identity and the adoption of wallet technology. And I said, "Are you sure this is right?" He says, "Yeah." So I'm not much of a graphics artist. I use Windows Paint in Windows 10. But I was able to do this. I was able to take the Gartner hype curve and attach it to Daryl's curve. And I think this is really where we are. We're at the green line where there's lots of good stuff happening, and there is some asymptotic acceleration happening. But I think we still have to go through, the phases of the Gartner hype curve. And again, this is just kind of to emphasize where we are and to proceed with exuberance and caution. And with that, we probably do have time for questions, but I'm not sure we're set up for questions. There's my email address. There's my Twitter account. Some days I feel like the guy in the picture. That's why he's there. And I appreciate your time. I also appreciate all the work and effort of the organizing committee for inviting me and having me come up. I get a little emotional. I want to also thank the translators, because they've been key to making this a truly international event and making us English speakers feel at home. And thank you very much.